Good afternoon and welcome to the podcast Avangarda with Ionuț Vulpescu. Today I have the privilege of welcoming a distinguished guest, one of the most respected voices in international thought and European diplomacy, Thierry de Montbrial, founder and the president of French Institute for International Relations, and an intellectual who has shaped debates on Europe for decades. Mr. Montbrial, I'm very grateful for your presence and for accepting my invitation.
It is with a great pleasure. Thank you very much.
We are filming this special episode at the National Foundation for Science and Art, run for the academician Maia Simionescu. This is a familiar place for you. You are in Bucharest to attend a new edition of the international colloquium Pensée l'Europe, which we initially founded together with academician Eugen Simion. What does this place mean to you in particular? What does the colloquium Pensée l'Europe represent? And how do you recall the memory of Professor Eugen Simion?
Thank you very much. So all these questions are in fact interrelated. I have to go back to my very first visit to your country, which actually took place in 1990. 1990, that is just...
Immediately after the revolution.
Exactly, immediately after. In fact, I had been invited before several times under the old regime and the communist regime, but for various reasons, I always refused to come in those circumstances. So, but I had some friends, Romanian friends, including, I remember an ambassador, quite a distinguished intellectual. He was ambassador of Ceausescu, but nevertheless, he was quite respected in the US and elsewhere. His first name was Mircea. I think that is his name in the beginning of my memoirs on Romania. Anyway, I visited your country in June, I think it was, of 1990. And it is the first time. I went to Cluj at first. And on my way back from Cluj to Bucharest, I had an appointment with President Iliescu, who had just been taking his office at Cotroceni. And of course, nobody had ever used the palace because it had been built for Ceausescu, but not used by him. And I remember that my flight from Cluj was late. It arrived late in Bucharest. And the driver didn't know where to go, at what entrance in this huge palace. So we arrived at the palace, we are about half an hour late. And when at last we arrived, I found President Iliescu waiting for me because he himself didn't know exactly what was his office and place. So, I was immediately interested in this man who I think was a real statesman. Maybe we can discuss about him later. And it was that very first visit also that I went to the Romanian Academy. But at that time, it was not yet Eugen Simion. I have not met him that first time. It was his predecessor as president of the academy, but I was
Professor Drăgănescu, probably.
Absolutely,
I think, the first president.
Yes. He was a good man, but of course he had not the charisma and the immense qualities that.
Also, he became ambassador after the.
I have lost actually trace of him, but I remember the first contacts were very polite, very I was also immediately fascinated by the fact that all those people in the academy at the time, I'm talking of 1990, that is 35 years ago, and many of these academicians at the time spoke fluent French. French culture at the time was very, very present and visible, and they were also eager to meet French intellectuals, and I was relatively young at the time. So I was immediately also attracted to that. Anyway, that was my first visit. The second visit was 6 years later, in 1996, and since then, every year, at least once, since 1996. But my real encounter with Eugen Simion was in 1996, and we immediately became friends. But I think I can say also that I developed very friendly relations with President Iliescu, which kept on for many years. So Eugen Simion, he was a literary critic, as everybody knows. He had a huge, very wide culture, literature, international literature, but he knew, of course, very well Romanian literature, and he talked to me a lot about Romanian great literature. But he was also extremely well equipped to analyze French literature. And also, although we were very different minds, we are two different kinds of people, but we got along very well together. We could understand each other without having to talk too much on certain subjects. So we had discussions on almost every possible subject about the year during the war. Yeah, and he was very active. He was a real entrepreneur, a cultural entrepreneur. And this is also an aspect that I liked a lot with him. And this is the story of this seminar, Penser l'Europe, which meant a lot to us because the starting point was that now, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, Europe was going to be reunited in a way, but the kind of Europe we were restarting was very different, of course, from the pre-war Europe. So usually in the West, we used to speak together, the Atlantic, transatlantic world, in fact, but we had very few contacts with what we used to call Eastern Europe at the time. So our starting point was, well, let us try to organize, to create a seminar, a yearly seminar, to discuss the significance of Europe in the 21st century, not too much from the geopolitical viewpoint, which is my own field, together with economics, but from a wider perspective and the cultural perspective, which was not necessarily to be dominated by the Anglo-Saxon perspective or the German perspective. So that's the beginning of everything.
This is the 22nd edition. In the past 22 years, what notable changes have you observed in the dynamics of Penser l'Europe?
Well, the answer is relatively simple because if you look around, let's say 2000, to simplify, that was the top of the ideology of globalization. And the general mood at the time was quite optimistic for the world altogether because of that ideology of globalization, but also at the European level, because most commentators, in a large sense, took the enlargement and the continuation of the enlargement of Europe as a positive factor that was coherent with globalization phenomena. Nevertheless, a few people, like Eugen Simion or myself, were much more skeptical about this evolution, not only for technical, geopolitical, or economic reasons. We had doubts about the sustainability of globalization, but we also had some doubts about the possibility to enlarge in a continuous way the European Union without running the risk of, at some point, of a deconstruction of this very bold endeavor, which is the European Union itself. You know, to take for granted the survival of the European Union over a long period of time is a real bet. It doesn't go in any obvious way. So the cultural aspects of such a problem always dominated our discussions, but I think that most of the participants of this seminar, we also use the word Paris Club, Bucharest Club sometimes. Most of them want to be optimistic about the future. You have to be more critical minded to understand what are the fragilities of this construction. Now, with the Ukraine war, which is not only the Ukraine war, because we had also the pandemic and then the Ukraine war, we are now all aware of the great fragilities, and we believe that our discussions, in a certain sense, are more important than ever.
In your journal, Journal de Românie, Journal Românesc, which was translated and published in Romania, you recall giving a speech on the future of history and the future of the European Union. Do they coincide? How much have these perspectives changed since then? We should be thinking, imagining, and shaping Europe today?
Well, I think that when I wrote or gave this speech, I think the speech you are talking about was actually my speech when I was elected at the Romanian Academy. That was in the year 2000. So it was precisely at the top of the optimism about the world and the European Union. And I took, I think, a more philosophical and optimistic approach for a number of reasons. Now, when I think about these subjects, I think more in historical terms rather than philosophical terms. I think that we, when I say we, it's very large we, or us, you know. When we thought of the future of Europe after the collapse of the Soviet Union, many among us were impressed by the Fukuyama kind of approach, which says in a nutshell that market economy, like an equation, like a chemical equation, you know, market economy plus democracy implies peace and prosperity, and vice versa. You know, it's for those who have learned a little bit of chemistry, like a reversible chemical equation. Peace and prosperity also imply market economy and democracy. In fact, this is not the case, because if you take a historical perspective, you can observe that, well, if you take market economy, I am a theoretician, an economist theorist originally. So I can tell you, I taught a lot economics, many circumstances, and the market economy is not so easy to define. In fact, it seems very easy to define, but in fact, it's not so easy, because what do we mean exactly by a market when you have a small number of huge corporations, for instance? That's the sort of problems when you have a lot of monopolies or quasi-monopolies or oligopolies. So market economy needs institutions, and so which institutions, and so forth and so on. Democracy, you have many kinds of democracy, even if you consider that the concept of democracy is, well, the government of the people, for instance, but what is the people? No. I don't know if you have time, if you give me 2 minutes for an anecdote to illustrate the Rousseau a version of democracy. Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Rousseau, who is the inventor of communism. Jean-Jacques Rousseau is the inventor of communism, because the French Revolution actually has brought the two basic kinds of democracies: liberal democracies with Voltaire, no, and
social contract.
Social contract is Rousseau. But Voltaire was much more liberal. He was fundamentally a liberal in modern terminology. And Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who was a very great writer, superb writer, was the inventor of communism. So my anecdote is the following. In 1996, actually the same year as my second visit to Bucharest, I was in Moscow, just after the re-election of Boris Yeltsin. You know, Boris Yeltsin was very ill, he had heart problems, but nevertheless he ran to election and was elected. And I saw somewhere an old Russian lady. She seemed to me very old, probably much younger than I am today. And I asked her, whom did you vote for? Whom did you vote for? And she said, her answer was, I made a mistake. I said, what do you mean by I have made a mistake? She said, I have made a mistake because I did not vote for Yeltsin. I said, what do you mean? I said, it's obvious, because if I should have voted for him, and I have voted for, I think it was Zhuganov, the communist candidate. So the lesson of this story is a beautiful lecture. It could be a beautiful lecture for young political scientists, because it is exactly the communist approach. You know, if I am a real Democrat, I should vote like the people. And the people, what does it mean that the people is always right? It means that in an election, it represents more than 50%. So as an elector, I should guess what the result of the vote will be. No? And I have to, therefore, to add my personal vote so that ultimately, if everybody were voting well, the result should be close to 100%, of course. And in fact, it is, if you read Jean-Jacques Rousseau's Contrat Social, Social Contract, if you read it carefully, you find this idea, which is communist, very, very communist. So that's an interesting anecdote because it's very simple and everybody can understand what I have just told you. So my point is, going back to the fundamentals, that there are several definitions and even if you agree on a definition, you have a number of institutional possibilities. So when you use market economy plus democracy, it's relatively ill-defined. And if you try to define precisely what peace means, it's a very complex concept, much more complex than to say there is no war. You know, peace is today. In fact, are we in war or peace? Is it war or peace? It's not easy to answer the question today. I mean. So I would say that the big difference today and 20 years ago or so is that today in every mind there is the possibility of a return to a real war, big, large, in Europe, something that most people would not even have dared to think about at the beginning of this century. And you, with your generation, I think you understand very well what I mean.
As a European, do you have any fears about the future of our continent?
I am very wary about the future of the European Union itself, you see. I think that would be a long story. We do not have time, this time at least, to go into the details. But I think that the Ukraine war should never have taken place. I think the original mistake was, but I think now, but I thought at the time, the original mistake was not to have taken seriously the demand of Russia for a revision of the security architecture of Europe, which, in my judgment, was legitimate. I think because after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the background behind the Helsinki Treaty had totally changed. So it was. It would be legitimate, to revise this. The West did not accept that. Of course, I do not deny that the Russians themselves, with Putin, especially after 2005, made also a number of provocations. But if we had been wise enough to review the whole security architecture of Europe, what would we have today? We would have Ukraine still in its 1991 borders. It would almost surely be a neutral state. But like Austria, Austria after World War II became neutral. And this is how they escaped the invasion from the Soviet Union at the time. And I remind also all those who watch or listen to us, remember them that Austria, member of the European Union, is still neutral. So we have missed one critical step, and today we have answered to the Russian invasion of 2022 by what? Sanctions, and still further commitments for further enlargements of the European Union. But the European Union, as it is today, is already extremely large, very unstable, because we do not respect economic disciplines, because we have public expenditures are exploding everywhere, and politically, as we can observe, all of us, illiberal political movements are prospering or developing almost everywhere. So I think that if we do not have a serious, strong reaction to this trend, we could be in trouble in the foreseeable future.
What role does Eastern Europe still play in the strategic construction of Europe? Do you believe that countries such as Romania are truly integrated into Europe's geopolitical compass?
You know, it's almost impossible to say precisely what it means to be fully integrated. I would not be really able to say it. When I have the pleasure of being here, because I love your country, I am in Romania. Of course, you're a member of the European Union, but for me, you are a recent member of the European Union. And you have a past. Of course, you have a very interesting history, generally speaking. But from my viewpoint, your recent past is still there, very much so. It's normal. It's normal. When I look at Poland or the Baltic states, I see countries which I respect a lot also, but they are dominated by only one question, which is to make sure that the Russian Empire, the historical Russian Empire, will not come back again and swallow them. So the weight of history is very visible in almost in all, I should say, the countries that the West used to call Eastern Europe, because during the Cold War we called Eastern Europe all the countries which were behind the so-called Iron Curtain. These historical factors are very, very pregnant. Again, one of the difficulties today is that clearly the countries which I mentioned, especially Poland, the Baltic states, they have priorities which are not necessarily fully understandable by a country like Spain, for instance, which is very far away from Russia. But the fact is that now, as I said a few minutes ago, the fear of a real war is there almost everywhere. And to that I add that the very construction of the European Union has become quite fragile. So we have to be extremely effective, particularly for the young political class in Europe, of which you're a member yourself, I think that it's really historical moment to have a good understanding of the trends which are going on, to avoid the kind of big mistakes that have been done in the interwar period, or also at the very beginning of the 20th century, that is before World War I. Because if you try to compare the current situation to other critical periods in the 20th century, there are basically two models, the models of pre-World War I and the model of pre-World War II. And they lead to different kinds of political contexts. And today we have a third context, of course.
You are a great friend of Romania. Speaking of Romania, in your book, I think two figures recur as exemplary personalities: Professor Eugen Simion and President Ion Iliescu. You once wrote that if you were asked to describe President Ion Iliescu in one word, that word would be credibility. Could you share with us why credibility was, in your view, the only suitable word to describe his honor?
No, I wouldn't say it is the only word, but as you just stated, I think that it is a good word. If I have only one word, it might be the best one, perhaps. You see, again, I am more and more interested in history. I think it is impossible to do good politics in troubled times if you do not have a sense of history. I think that Ion Iliescu had, even though he was an engineer, he was not particularly educated in history, but he had a sense of history. To become the leader of the country after extraordinary experience such as the collapse of the sudden collapse of the communist regimes of what we used to call Eastern Europe, and particularly Ceausescu, the transition could have been much worse. I admired at the time, and I still admire today, that is almost 35 years later, that transition went so smoothly. It is a miracle, in fact. And for instance, if I compare with a totally different situation, but take the fall of Saddam Hussein in Iraq, which was provoked by the American interventions. Our American friends did immediately a huge mistake. What was the huge mistake? It was to banish all the generals, the soldiers, the officers of Saddam Hussein. And as a result, we have the ISIS, move, the Islamic State, which continue to exist in various ways. The wise approach would have been to understand that the majority of those generals would have been very happy to serve the new government. Some of them perhaps would have been better in jail, but probably only a majority. So I think that after such, again, I'm not comparing, just an example of what happens after a huge shock on a nation. So I think that President Iliescu, who also was a formidable communicator, he had a lot of charm, and a great sense of humor. I will tell you an anecdote, very short, on this. But I think that he was the right man at the right place after the collapse of Ceausescu, and he himself, I think even his enemies in these countries, his political enemies, recognize that in terms of personal integrity, there are not so many, if any, comparable example. So my anecdote. Once, one of my discussions, he told me about the visit of the then patriarch of the church, of the Orthodox Church, coming to see him to discuss the issue of the fortune of the church. So what should be done with the assets that had been confiscated by the communist regime, etc., etc. And according to Iliescu, so the patriarch or his representative asked him, Mr. President, how do you expect to deal with the issue? And Iliescu answered to him what he told me, in a Christian way. That was a very good answer.
Yes, very political, very good.
It's very good. It was very good, this sort of thing. So I think that he had a bundle of qualities that, I repeat, made him, I think, the right man at the right place. And to my humble opinion, most of the criticisms that have been addressed to him, given the global picture of the time, were relatively minor.
Do you believe history will ultimately do justice to Ion Iliescu and his role in Romania's modern development?
I think so, because he, as you just say, had a modern vision, for instance, on ecology and many other key aspects of modern life. I think he had a good understanding. He was also very pragmatic. He was not at all. That was one of his qualities, I think. A dogmatist, and I can understand, having known him a little bit, I understand also better why a man like him was a source of embarrassment for somebody like Ceausescu, because Ceausescu obviously was anything but pragmatic. So I think he was quite modern in some sense. I know that some people reproach him not to have been tough enough, not to have been proactive enough. But again, who could have done better in the circumstances? One of the reasons why I like your country is that sometimes it makes me think of mine. I think that governing Romania is not more easy than to govern France, and perhaps for similar reasons. So to give lessons, to others, you should have done this and that. Okay, so it's important to take the global vision. But when I landed yesterday in Bucharest, I asked them, my first Romanian friends I saw, I asked them how was the public opinion's reaction to the death of Ion Iliescu, and the answer I received was that it was that was respect. If I am told the right interpretation, it is respect that dominated over too easy criticisms.
This is the most important. Right. Yeah, you have frequently compared Ion Iliescu with President Mitterand. What were the main basis of these similarities in your view?
Well, two actually. One is that the two men, well, first they were perhaps sharing the same kind of very loose approach to the idea of socialism. That was not again, I never saw Iliescu as a leftist fanatic. Just saying that you laugh because it was nothing in his character, and it was the same for Mitterrand. But Mitterrand was also a great speaker, and he used his vocabulary to adjust pragmatically and intuitively to the feelings of his audience. But was much. He has a lot of political sensitivity in that sense. So the two men can be compared in that respect. And second, I think that the two of them, for me, are relatively similar in terms of their political skills altogether. That is to react day after day smartly to complicated political situations under turmoil.
Do you still believe in the role of European elites? We can observe a global crisis of leadership. In our view, how has the world arrived at this state where questions of leadership, trust, and professional competence in governance are deeply challenged?
So now we are talking about the immediate, the present and the immediate future. I think that this question of leadership is inseparable from the question of democracy today. The basic failure of democracy today in many countries relies in the fact that the democratic government do not deliver. That is, they are unable too often to identify the problems to be resolved, that have to be resolved in the interest of the peoples. Second, if the problems are identified, they are totally unable to formulate a solution and to implement it. Typically, if you take the case of my country, of France, the pension reform is an absolute necessity that many countries, even in Western Europe, have done, in fact, and we still are unable to do it, which will be very costly for us if we continue in this non-reactivity attitude. But it's not only, that's just an example. So generally speaking, our countries are inefficient, unable to identify the problems and to solve them. And from the little I know of the political scene in Romania, I am not sure it is so much better than in France. So that's the key problem. But of course, all that is inseparable from deeper trends. For instance, I think the technological trends have, to a large extent, contributed to undermine the political scene in many countries. For instance, all the debate about the post-truth world relates clearly to this issue. If most of the young people, for instance, are no longer able to discriminate between what is true and what is not true, I understand that politics is extraordinarily difficult to conduct. And demagogy then is likely to prevail. So if we can take a second example, which I think is also something we should think very deeply about. I see that because of wokeism, for instance, today, but wokeism in a very large sense, of or trends which have actually started more or less 20 years ago, more or less, and what developed in the last 20 years for sure. The governments, the parliaments, are more and more invited to vote on fundamental societal issues, which I am not sure are or should be the main task of parliaments. I mean, task number one of a parliament historically is to vote for a budget. That has historically been the starting point, But if the main subject of politics becomes homosexuality or LGBT or these sort of topics, I am not telling you my own preferences, but I think that these issues in the past were not, or certainly not at the core of politics. Today, issues such as those become or sometimes give the impression of becoming the real center of politics, and the traditional questions about how to spend money for increasing defense expenditures, to deal in a superficial way with these traditional issues, which nevertheless are likely to determine our future in a very strong way. So the crisis of democracy is what concerns me most for the time being. It is related to the efficiency issue, and if you put all these things together, we are back to the questions about the fate of the European Union itself.
You serve as counselor to President Valéry Giscard d'Estaing. Were there other great personalities who influenced your life and career?
In France, because could mention a number of names in different places, Giscard d'Estaing, but he had a very good prime minister whose name was Raymond Barre, who I was very close, I was, I think, a good friend of him. He was extremely intelligent and a man of great culture. He, by the way, his wife was from Hungary, so he had a real interest in Eastern Europe. I think that in some ways he was deeper than Valéry Giscard d'Estaing in a number of subjects. But intellectually, in France, I had, of course, a number. Since I'm a mathematician originally, I could mention you the names of a few great mathematicians, but I'm not sure that your public is too much interested in this.
Yeah. Maybe none aren't familiar with.
No, I gave you one name, Laurent Schwartz. Laurent Schwartz was one of the greatest French mathematicians. He was my own professor at the École Polytechnique, and then he was my colleague because when I was elected myself a professor of theoretical economics, but he was extremely open, wide-minded man, and but in the field of political science and the sort of subject that we have discussed, I would mention Raymond Aron, who definitely was one of the giants of the previous generation. But I could give you a long list. We could spend a whole discussion like this.
Kissinger, maybe.
Yeah, of course. So Kissinger, yes, of course. So,
what made Kissinger such a special figure?
For a combination of personal and intellectual reasons. In fact, one aspect of my own trajectory was that I was the founder of the policy planning staff in the French Foreign Ministry. That was in 1973. And soon after I created that, by the way, Pompidou was president, then died 1 year later. Giscard became president, and France could start a shift towards becoming more Atlanticist, if you wish. And I had a certain role in this. And Kissinger was Secretary of State and National Security Advisor to President Nixon and then Ford. And he, believe it or not, invited me for dinner. And it would be unthinkable today. I was 31, and he invited me for dinner. And I started to have a real conversation with him. Of course, it was a great honor for me, but it was also intellectually fascinating. And since then, until his very death, I saw him several times a year, actually, including 3 months before he died, so 2 years ago. So I think he was extraordinarily rational, but emotional too. But he was thinking rationally, but he had a great sensitivity. in spite of what his enemies said. But he, for all the big decisions, he considered the decisions with a very strong methodology, studying, what would be the different options given a problem, how to study the possible predictable consequences, the pros and the cons for each potential decision. And at the end of the day, optimizing, like in an economic approach, the situation to take the best possible solution. So that was, in that sense, very, very rational. He was a realist, and many people are making a confusion between realism and realpolitik. No, realism is not cynicism. Realism is to look at reality as it is, and when you have to make a choice, to choose an action facing a certain problem, you have to study, to look at the reality as it is, not through ideological lenses, you see. So this is what Kissinger was. Of course, his enemies attacked him on many grounds, but that's part of politics. His greatest achievement was probably the way he established links with China in 1972. It was a great moment. And the case of the Vietnam War, he was very much criticized for the end of the war, but to a large extent, that was due to the pressure of the American public opinion to stop the war in a non-strategic way, because the public opinion, the pressure of the public opinion, especially after the Watergate scandal, made it almost impossible to act in a totally rational way. Yes, Kissinger played an important role in my life.
If you were to condense into 3 essential ideas the wisdom you have gained from all these years of reflection and analyze, what would they be? Only 3 ideas.
First, realism, in the way I defined it. Look at the world as it is. Don't try to behave as if you detained the truth, and particularly in the moral, the ethical aspects. Neither me nor you nor whoever can present himself to say ethically I am the master. No. So second, caution. You should be cautious. I think it's a basic piece of wisdom, cautiousness. Always remember that things can evolve in directions that you have not foreseen. So always remain adaptable, but at the same time with a clear idea of your basic strategic lines. And third, always pay attention positively to the others, be it other countries, or other individuals, and to look at people or countries in a benevolent way is not, in my judgment, weakness, it is strength.
What is one question you have never been asked in an interview, but would have liked to be asked?
That's to be in another life, in fact. That's the question. Well, I believe in destiny, fate. No. So if I interpret the question, I regret nothing. And I regret nothing. I never consider that I have missed something. I have made, like everybody, a few mistakes in my life, but I have learned, each time I have learned a lot about them. And I don't know when my life will end, but be that as it may, I think I have been blessed enough in my real life.
We are deeply grateful for your presence in this unique conversation. Would you like to address a special message to our listeners for my podcast Avangarda with Ionuț Vulpescu?
Well, I think I should tell them that I thank you. I will tell them that if I were a Romanian citizen, I am sure that I would be very happy to watch your emission as often as possible. And I also perhaps would tell them that be happy, but remember, never lose sight that history can be tragic.
Thank you very much.